The giant cowboy waited nervously for his mail-order bride, clutching her faded letter as the dusty wagon rolled into the sun-baked frontier town. But instead of the expected woman, a beautiful black goddess stepped gracefully onto the wooden platform, her educated bearing and quiet dignity immediately drawing hostile stares from every corner of the settlement. The townspeople whispered with venom-laced tongues, "A woman like that don't belong here." They expected her gone by sunset, run out like countless others before her. But the cowboy, despite crushing social pressure, found himself drawn to her unexpected strength and refinement. What neither the town nor the cowboy knew was that this mysterious woman carried documents that could reshape everything, land deeds that would either elevate her to unimaginable power or paint a deadly target on her back. Would her hidden inheritance save them both, or destroy everything they'd begun to build together? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. Jeremiah Thornfield shifted his weight from boot to boot, the worn letter crumpled between his calloused fingers. The September sun beat down mercilessly on Copper Ridge's main street as he watched the horizon for dust clouds. His mail-order bride Sarah was supposed to arrive today. 3 months of correspondence had built his hopes higher than they'd been since he'd lost his parents to fever 2 winters back. The ranch struggled without a woman's touch. Meals consisted of burnt beans and stale bread. His clothes bore patches on patches. At 32, Jeb figured he'd waited long enough for love to find him naturally. Cornelius Blackwood emerged from the territorial office, his black suit immaculate despite the desert heat. The man controlled most of Copper Ridge through a combination of legal maneuvering and calculated intimidation. He owned the general store, held mortgages on half the ranches, and charged premium rates for access to the creek that ran through his property. "Expecting company, Thornfield?" Cornelius's pale eyes held their usual mixture of condescension and calculation. "My bride arrives today." Jeb tried to keep the nervousness from his voice. "How romantic." Cornelius's smile never reached his eyes. "Hope she's hardy stock. This territory breaks the weak ones quick." Across the street, Margaret Sinclair swept the porch of her saloon with sharp, efficient strokes. Maggie had arrived in Copper Ridge 5 years ago with secrets of her own and a tongue that could strip paint. She'd built the only establishment in town that could rival Cornelius's influence, though she maintained her power through wit rather than wealth. Near the stable, Ezekiel Morrison tended to a lame horse with gentle hands. The old man had appeared in town a decade ago, speaking little about his past, but demonstrating an uncanny knowledge of frontier survival. His dark skin and military bearings suggested stories he chose not to share. A dust cloud appeared on the eastern road. Jeb's heart hammered against his ribs as he straightened his cleanest shirt and ran fingers through his hair. The wagon grew larger, pulled by 2 tired mules, and driven by a weathered man Jeb recognized as one of the territory's regular mail carriers. The wagon creaked to a stop. Jeb stepped forward, words of greeting prepared, but they died in his throat. The woman who stepped gracefully from the wagon bore no resemblance to Sarah's description. Where Sarah had promised blonde hair and blue eyes, this woman possessed rich brown skin and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. Her traveling dress, though dusty from the journey, had been cut with obvious skill. She carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with the uncertainty of her situation. The street fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. "You're not Sarah." Jeb's statement hung between them like an accusation. "No, I'm Seraphina Whitmore." Her voice carried the refined accent of Charleston's educated class. "I paid for passage to start fresh in the territory." Maggie's broom stopped sweeping. Cornelius stepped closer, his territorial instincts clearly triggered. Ezekiel continued working, but his attention focused entirely on the unfolding scene. "This is highly irregular." Cornelius's voice carried the authority he used to settle disputes in his favor. We weren't expecting your kind of visitor. Serafina's chin lifted slightly. I have documentation of my payment and legal right to travel freely through the territory. She produced papers from a leather satchel with movements that spoke of careful planning rather than desperate flight. Jeb noticed her hands remained steady despite the hostile stares gathering from every doorway and window along the street. Documentation can be forged. Cornelius examined the papers with theatrical skepticism. Copper Ridge maintains certain standards of order. My papers are legitimate. Serafina's tone remained calm, but steel entered her voice. I seek nothing more than honest work and peaceful residence. Jeb found himself studying her face. Intelligence radiated from her features alongside a determination that reminded him of his mother facing down creditors after his father's death. Something about her bearing suggested she'd faced worse challenges than a hostile frontier town. Honest work? Maggie's laugh carried sharp edges. What honest work you figure to find way out here? I can read, write, and cipher better than most. I have medical knowledge and legal training. Serafina's answer demonstrated preparation rather than desperation. The admission sent visible ripples through the gathered crowd. Educated women were rare enough in the territory. Educated women of her background were virtually unheard of. Cornelius's pale eyes narrowed. Legal training? Where exactly did you acquire such unusual education? Charleston Female Seminary and private tutoring. Serafina met his gaze directly. My family believed in thorough preparation for life's challenges. Jeb watched the exchange with growing fascination. Most people wilted under Cornelius's interrogation. Serafina seemed to grow more composed with each question. Family? Cornelius pressed. What family sends their daughter alone into the wilderness? For the first time, Serafina's composure flickered. That's my private concern. The admission of secrecy shifted the crowd's mood from hostile curiosity to outright suspicion. Jeb saw the calculation in Cornelius's expression and recognized the danger building like storm clouds. Private concerns become public matters when they threaten community safety. Cornelius gestured toward the sheriff's office. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in more official surroundings. Jeb surprised himself by stepping forward. She hasn't threatened anyone. The lady just needs a place to rest while she sorts her situation. The words emerged before he could consider their implications. Every eye turned toward him with expressions ranging from shock to disapproval. The silence stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap. Jeb's offer hung in the desert air, while Cornelius's face darkened with barely contained fury. Serafina studied Jeb with surprise, clearly unaccustomed to unexpected allies. You're making a mistake, Thornfield. Cornelius's voice carried the weight of financial threats. Your ranch mortgage comes due in 6 months. Jeb felt the familiar knot of worry tighten in his stomach. The drought had killed half his cattle and ruined his hay crop. Without Sarah's promised dowry, he'd already been facing ruin. Now he was compounding his problems by defying the most powerful man in the territory. But something in Serafina's steady gaze reminded him of principles his father had died defending. She can stay in my barn until she finds proper lodging. Jeb's voice cracked slightly but held firm. Cornelius stepped closer, close enough that Jeb could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the scent of calculated menace. This conversation isn't finished. He stalked back toward his office, boot heels striking the wooden boardwalk like hammer blows. The crowd began to disperse, but not before casting looks that promised future trouble. Maggie lingered longer than the others, her sharp eyes moving between Jeb and Serafina with obvious calculation. You picked an interesting time to grow a backbone. Cowboy. Serafina gathered her small bag and leather satchel, movements precise despite her obvious fatigue. I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Thornfield. I won't impose longer than necessary. Jeb loaded her belongings into his wagon, acutely aware of the watching eyes behind curtained windows. The ride to his ranch passed in uncomfortable silence, both lost in thoughts of consequences they'd set in motion. His property stretched across a valley between 2 low mesas, marked by a house that needed paint and corrals that needed mending. The barn offered clean straw and protection from the elements. But Jeb felt shame at housing an educated woman like livestock. "It's temporary," he said, more to convince himself than her. "It's generous." Serafina examined the space with approval rather than disappointment. "I've slept in worse conditions." Over the following days, Serafina proved her worth in ways Jeb hadn't expected. She treated his injured horse's leg with knowledge that surpassed the local veterinarian. When he struggled with a contract from a cattle buyer, she explained the legal terminology that would have cost him hundreds of dollars. Her medical skills became apparent when old Pete Garrison arrived with a badly infected hand. The town's doctor had declared the wound beyond saving, but Serafina cleaned it with techniques learned in Charleston's hospitals and created a poultice that drew out the poison. Within a week, Pete was spreading word of her abilities throughout the valley. "That woman's got more learning in her little finger than most folks got in their whole head," he told anyone who'd listen. The praise created a subtle shift in local attitudes. Farmers began arriving at Jeb's ranch, seeking Serafina's help with everything from sick children to property disputes. She never refused assistance and never demanded payment, though most left something in gratitude. Cornelius watched these developments with growing alarm. His authority depended on controlling access to specialized knowledge and services. A woman who could provide legal advice and medical care for free threatened his carefully constructed monopoly. He began spreading whispers about the impropriety of an unmarried woman living on a bachelor's property. The gossip found fertile ground among the more traditional residents, though those who'd benefited from Serafina's help remained stubbornly loyal. Jeb found himself defending her reputation with increasing frequency. More troubling, he realized his defense stemmed from genuine feelings rather than mere chivalry. Her intelligence fascinated him. Her quiet strength reminded him daily of his own moral weaknesses. 3 weeks after her arrival, Ezekiel appeared at the ranch while Jeb worked in the corral. The old man rarely visited anyone, preferring to keep his own counsel. "That woman's stirring up powerful interests," Ezekiel said without preamble. "She's helping people." Jeb wiped sweat from his forehead. "Didn't know that was a crime." "Isn't about crime. It's about debts." Ezekiel's weathered face carried knowledge of old wounds. "Some debt's been waiting long time to get paid." The cryptic warning bothered Jeb more than direct threats would have. Ezekiel possessed information about the territory's history that others seemed to have forgotten or chosen to ignore. That evening, Cornelius arrived at the ranch with papers that made Jeb's blood run cold. An official complaint about harboring a vagrant, signed by enough prominent citizens to carry legal weight. "This ends now." Thornfield. Cornelius spread the documents across Jeb's kitchen table. "Either she leaves voluntarily, or the sheriff removes her by force." Serafina emerged from the barn, drawn by raised voices. She read the complaint with steady eyes while Jeb's world seemed to crumble around him. 24 hours, Cornelius continued. "Then this becomes a legal matter with consequences for both of you." After he left, Serafina sat at the table studying the papers with professional focus. Jeb expected tears or pleading. Instead, she displayed the calm concentration of someone accustomed to fighting battles through intelligence rather than emotion. "Mr. Thornfield, there's something you need to know about why I'm really here." She opened her leather satchel and withdrew documents that made Jeb's breath catch. "These papers prove my grandfather Augustus Whitmore legally homesteaded 640 acres of land in this valley 30 years ago." Her voice remained steady despite the magnitude of her revelation. "Land that includes the primary water source everyone depends on." Jeb stared at the official territorial seal on the documents. "You're saying you own the creek that runs through Cornelius's property. I'm saying my grandfather earned title to it through military service and proper legal filing." Serafina met his astonished gaze. "I'm not a vagrant seeking charity, Mr. Thornfield. I'm the rightful heir to land worth more than everything Cornelius Blackwood claims to own." Jeb stared at the documents spread across his kitchen table. The territorial seal gleamed authentic under lamplight. Augustus Whitmore's name appeared in official script alongside legal descriptions that matched the valley's geography perfectly. "Your grandfather was a buffalo soldier." The pieces clicked together in Jeb's mind. "That's why Ezekiel keeps watching you." Serafina nodded. her fingers tracing the faded ink. He served with distinction, earned his homestead rights through the Bounty Land Act, filed properly with the Territorial Office in 1857. Then why doesn't everyone know about this? Because powerful men made sure the records disappeared after his death. Serafina's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. My family spent years searching for proof of his claim. Jeb studied her face in the flickering light. Everything about her presence in Copper Ridge suddenly made sense. The careful preparation, the legal knowledge, the way she'd examined the valley with strategic eyes. You came here to claim your inheritance. I came here to reclaim what was stolen. She folded the papers with reverent care. My grandfather built a cabin near the creek's source, raised cattle and horses, lived peacefully until fever took him in 1862. What happened to the land after he died? Certain influential residents convinced the Territorial Office that the filing contained errors. The property reverted to public domain and was promptly claimed by those same residents. Jeb didn't need her to name names. Cornelius Blackwood's family had controlled water rights in the valley for as long as anyone could remember. The source of their wealth and power suddenly took on a much darker complexion. Why wait 30 years to press your claim? Because 30 years ago I was 7 years old, and my family was fleeing Charleston after my father was murdered for teaching freed slaves to read. Serafina's composure finally cracked slightly. It took this long to find the proof and gather courage to face what claiming it might cost. The weight of her revelation settled over them like desert darkness. Serafina wasn't just challenging Cornelius's authority. She was threatening to expose the foundation upon which his entire empire was built. He'll never let you take possession peacefully. I know. Her calm returned, steel-backed and unwavering. That's why I've been building support among the people he's cheated and overcharged for decades. Over the following week, Serafina's strategy became clear. Instead of directly confronting Cornelius through legal channels, she began offering water access at fair rates to struggling ranchers. Word spread quickly that the mysterious woman at Thornfield's ranch possessed both legal authority and generous terms. Farmers who'd been paying Cornelius premium prices for creek water found themselves welcomed at the source with reasonable contracts and respectful treatment. Serafina's education proved invaluable as she explained water rights law to men who'd never understood why they owed fees for what flowed naturally through the valley. Cornelius's response came swift and vicious. He called in debts, raised prices at his store, and made clear that anyone dealing with Serafina would face economic consequences. Several ranchers backed down under pressure, but others held firm. Pete Garrison became her most vocal supporter, spreading stories of her medical skills and legal knowledge throughout the territory. His infected hand had healed completely, leaving only faint scars where the doctor had planned amputation. That woman saved my hand, and probably my life, he told everyone who'd listen. If she says she owns water rights, I believe her. Maggie Sinclair proved a more surprising ally. The saloon owner appeared at Jeb's ranch on a Thursday morning with information that made Serafina's eyes narrow with interest. Cornelius has been charging me double what he charges other businesses for water delivery, Maggie said bluntly. Claims it's because liquor establishments use more, but I know he's lying. Why help us? Serafina asked. Because I hate being played for a fool more than I hate change. Maggie's sharp smile carried predatory edges. Besides, you've been good for business. Men come to town hoping to catch sight of the educated woman who's got Cornelius running scared. The alliance with Maggie provided crucial intelligence about Cornelius's operations. Through her network of customers and suppliers, they learned he'd been systematically overcharging businesses and residents while claiming exclusive rights to water that legally belonged to Serafina's family. But success brought new dangers. Anonymous threats appeared under Jeb's door. His cattle found poisoned water in their troughs. Equipment disappeared from his barn with suspicious regularity. Serafina faced more direct intimidation. Men followed her when she traveled to the Territorial Office. Rocks shattered windows in Jeb's house during the night. The message was clear: leave voluntarily or face escalating consequences. Instead of retreating, Serafina doubled her efforts to establish legal standing. She filed formal papers claiming her inheritance, hired a territorial attorney, and began documenting every instance of harassment for future legal action. The breaking point came when Sarah finally arrived on the afternoon stage. Jeb's original mail-order bride stepped down from the dusty coach exactly as described in her letters: blonde hair, blue eyes, and a conventional prettiness that would have satisfied him completely 3 months earlier. She carried the dowry money that could save his ranch and wore the expectant smile of a woman anticipating her new life. But Jeb felt nothing beyond polite concern for her welfare. 3 months of living near Serafina had ruined him for conventional contentment. Her intelligence challenged him daily. Her courage inspired him to examine his own moral compromises. Her quiet strength made Sarah's feminine helplessness seem childish rather than charming. Sarah took one look at Serafina and understood the situation with feminine intuition that needed no explanation. "I see I've arrived at an inconvenient time." The confrontation Jeb had dreaded became instead a moment of surprising grace. Sarah possessed more wisdom than her simple letters had suggested. She recognized the depth of feeling between Jeb and Serafina and chose dignity over demanded rights. "Perhaps I should explore other opportunities in the territory," she said with gentle finality. Her gracious withdrawal eliminated one source of conflict but created another. The entire town now knew Jeb had chosen an unconventional woman over a conventional bride. The social consequences would extend far beyond whispered gossip. Cornelius seized on the development as proof of Serafina's corrupting influence on traditional values. His whisper campaign gained new momentum among residents who viewed Jeb's choice as evidence of dangerous changes threatening their community's moral foundation. Sarah's departure marked a turning point that rippled through Copper Ridge like stones dropped in still water. Within hours, every resident knew Jeb Thornfield had chosen principle over convention. The ramifications split the community along lines that had nothing to do with water rights and everything to do with deeply held beliefs about proper social order. Serafina threw herself into building her legal case with methodical precision. Her attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Thomas Crawford from the territorial capital, arrived with enthusiasm for what he called the most interesting property dispute he'd encountered in 20 years of practice. Crawford examined Augustus Whitmore's documents with professional admiration. "Your grandfather was thorough. Military service records, proper filing fees, witness signatures. This claim could stand up in any territorial court." But establishing legal right proved different from claiming physical possession. Cornelius had spent 3 decades building financial and political relationships that extended far beyond Copper Ridge. His influence reached territorial judges, land office officials, and business interests throughout the region. The first countermove came through bureaucratic channels. Suddenly, Serafina's filed claim encountered procedural delays, missing forms, lost paperwork, scheduling conflicts that pushed hearings months into the future. Crawford recognized the tactics of systematic obstruction. "Someone's calling in favors to tie this up in red tape," he explained during a strategy meeting at Jeb's ranch. "They're hoping to exhaust your resources or force you to abandon the claim out of frustration." Serafina's response demonstrated why her grandfather had chosen legal channels over violence decades earlier. She began documenting every delay, every missing document, every suspicious coincidence. Her Charleston education had taught her that corruption left paper trails for those patient enough to follow them. Meanwhile, her growing influence among local residents created its own momentum. Pete Garrison organized informal meetings where neighbors compared stories of overcharging and intimidation. The pattern that emerged painted Cornelius as a man who'd built wealth through systematic exploitation rather than honest business practices. Maggie provided crucial intelligence about the broader scope of Cornelius's operations. Through careful listening and discreet questioning, she learned he'd been manipulating property assessments, charging illegal fees for territorial services, and using his position to acquire distressed properties at unfair prices. "He's been running his own little kingdom out here," Maggie reported during one of their evening planning sessions, telling folks what territorial law requires when half of it's just his own rules designed to benefit him. Jeb found himself transformed by association with Serafina's campaign. Men who'd respected him as a solid rancher now viewed him with suspicion for his unconventional choice. But others began seeking his counsel, recognizing that anyone brave enough to defy Cornelius might possess wisdom worth hearing. His ranch became an unofficial gathering place for residents who'd grown tired of accepting exploitation as the price of frontier life. They arrived seeking Serafina's legal advice and stayed to discuss possibilities they'd never dared voice before. The conversations revealed decades of accumulated grievances. Widow Martinez had lost half her property to tax assessments that contradicted territorial law. The Jameson brothers paid double rates for water access because they'd once questioned Cornelius's billing practices. Dr. Hayes faced constant pressure to support Cornelius's medical opinions regardless of actual patient needs. Serafina listened to each story with careful attention, taking notes that would later become part of her comprehensive documentation of systematic corruption. But more importantly, she offered practical solutions based on actual territorial law rather than Cornelius's convenient interpretations. Her knowledge proved especially valuable during property disputes. When young Billy Patterson faced losing his inherited farm to unpaid fees, Serafina discovered the charges violated 3 separate territorial statutes. Her intervention saved his land and exposed another example of illegal practices. Each success strengthened her position while weakening Cornelius's control, but it also escalated his desperation. The harassment intensified beyond anonymous threats. Equipment disappeared from supporters' properties. Water deliveries faced mysterious delays. Business permits encountered sudden complications that required expensive legal resolution. Ezekiel finally revealed his connection to the growing conflict during a quiet conversation at his stable. The old man's knowledge of local history extended deeper than anyone had suspected. "Your grandfather was a good man," he told Serafina with quiet conviction. "Helped me when I needed help most. Figured someday his family might come looking for what was rightfully theirs. You knew him personally? Served together in the war. Came west together afterward." Ezekiel's weathered hands continued their work with practiced efficiency. "Been keeping watch over things ever since he died, waiting for someone with the strength to set things right." The revelation explained Ezekiel's protective interest and suggested he possessed information that could strengthen Serafina's case. But it also revealed the personal danger he'd accepted by supporting her claim against powerful interests that preferred buried history to stay buried. Crawford's investigation uncovered the mechanism behind Augustus Whitmore's property theft. After the soldier's death, a coalition of local investors had convinced the Territorial Land Office that his filing contained technical errors requiring immediate correction. The property had reverted to public status for exactly 1 day before being claimed by Cornelius's father through suspiciously expedited paperwork. It was legal theft, Crawford explained. Technically procedural, but practically fraudulent. They used bureaucratic complexity to steal from a dead man's heirs. The discovery shifted their strategy from simple inheritance claim to exposing systematic corruption spanning 3 decades. But it also raised stakes beyond property rights to questions of institutional legitimacy that powerful people had strong reasons to keep buried. Cornelius's response came through unexpected channels. Rather than direct confrontation, he began spreading rumors about Serafina's mental stability and moral character. The whisper campaign suggested she suffered from delusions of grandeur, fabricated legal documents, and seduced honest men into supporting fictional claims. The character assassination found receptive audiences among residents uncomfortable with social change. Some who'd initially supported her began expressing doubts about her true motives and mental fitness. But her documented successes in legal matters and medical treatment provided concrete evidence against abstract accusations. People could see her intelligence in action and judge for themselves whether her capabilities matched her claims. The tension building throughout the valley promised resolution one way or another. Too much had been revealed and too many positions taken for compromise to satisfy either side. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Ezekiel appeared at Jeb's ranch carrying a weathered leather satchel that looked older than the territory itself. His usually stoic expression carried the weight of secrets finally ready for daylight. Time's come to show what I've been keeping safe, he said, settling the satchel on the kitchen table with reverent care. Serafina watched him untie leather straps worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside lay documents that made her inheritance papers seem simple by comparison. Survey maps, territorial correspondence, property transfers, and financial records dating back to the valley's earliest settlement. Your grandfather asked me to keep these before he died, Ezekiel explained. Said someday folks would need proof of how things really happened in this place. Crawford examined the papers with growing excitement that transformed into professional awe. The documents revealed a systematic pattern of corruption stretching across 30 years and involving multiple territorial officials. Augustus Whitmore's property theft was just the beginning. The papers showed how Cornelius's father had used similar tactics to acquire dozens of properties from deceased settlers, struggling families, and anyone lacking political connections to fight back. This is bigger than we imagined, Crawford said, spreading survey maps that contradicted official territorial records. They've been falsifying documents, bribing officials, and stealing land on an industrial scale. The evidence painted a picture of institutional corruption that reached into the territorial capital. Land office officials had been systematically manipulated or bought. Survey records had been altered to benefit specific interests. Legal processes had been subverted to transfer wealth from legitimate owners to connected insiders. Serafina studied financial ledgers that showed the true scope of the conspiracy. Her grandfather's land represented only a fraction of property illegally transferred over 3 decades. Dozens of families had lost their rightful inheritance to the same bureaucratic manipulation that had stolen her legacy. We're not just fighting for my family's water rights, she realized. We're exposing theft that's affected half the families in this territory. But the revelation brought immediate danger. That afternoon, Cornelius arrived at the ranch with a territorial marshal and papers authorizing seizure of what he called stolen documents belonging to official territorial records. The confrontation might have ended Serafina's case before it reached court, but Crawford had anticipated such tactics. He'd already filed copies of the most crucial evidence with multiple territorial offices and arranged for legal protection under attorney-client privilege. You can seize the originals, Crawford told the marshal calmly, but the copies are already in legal channels beyond your jurisdiction. Cornelius's face revealed murderous fury, barely contained by the presence of official witnesses. His careful manipulation of legal processes was unraveling faster than he could counter through traditional corruption. The marshal, clearly uncomfortable with his role in what increasingly looked like a cover-up rather than legitimate law enforcement, performed his required duties with obvious reluctance. He seized the original documents but left Crawford's copies untouched. After they departed, Ezekiel revealed the final crucial element of his guardianship. Hidden beneath false bottom in the satchel lay testimony he'd written years earlier, sealed and witnessed, describing his personal knowledge of the conspiracy that had stolen Augustus Whitmore's property. Been carrying this burden 30 years, he said, handing Serafina the sealed envelope. Waiting for someone with the courage and knowledge to set things right. The testimony named names, described conversations, and provided first-hand witness accounts of how territorial officials had been bribed to manipulate property records. Ezekiel's military background and decades of respected community presence gave his words legal weight that would be difficult to dismiss or discredit. Crawford read the testimony with the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd finally found the key piece of evidence needed to win an unwinnable case. This gives us everything we need to expose the entire network of corruption. But Cornelius wasn't finished. Unable to suppress the evidence through legal channels, he turned to direct intimidation that crossed lines he'd previously avoided. That night, armed men surrounded Jeb's ranch house. They didn't attack or threaten violence directly, but their message was unmistakable. Abandon the legal case or face consequences that courts couldn't prevent. Jeb faced the choice he'd been avoiding since Serafina first revealed her inheritance claim. He could step back, protect his own safety, and let her fight alone against forces that clearly intended to stop her by any means necessary. Instead, he emerged from the house carrying his rifle and stood beside Serafina on the front porch. The symbolic gesture communicated his final commitment to supporting her cause regardless of personal cost. "You've made your choice, then," called the lead writer, his face hidden beneath a wide hat brim. "Made it weeks ago," Jeb replied steadily. The riders departed without violence, but everyone understood the confrontation had been a final warning rather than an empty gesture. Cornelius had abandoned legal maneuvering for direct action that placed all of them in immediate physical danger. Serafina spent that sleepless night preparing for what she recognized might be her last opportunity to present evidence before the conspiracy succeeded in silencing her permanently. Crawford arranged for an emergency hearing with a territorial judge from outside the local corruption network. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday at the territorial courthouse in a town 50 miles from Copper Ridge. Success would expose decades of systematic theft and restore property rights to dozens of victimized families. Failure would likely result in Serafina's disappearance and the permanent burial of evidence that threatened powerful political and financial interests. Maggie arrived at dawn with intelligence that confirmed their worst fears. Through her network of travelers and suppliers, she'd learned that Cornelius had hired professional gunmen from outside the territory. Men with reputations for solving problems that legal channels couldn't address. "This isn't about property rights anymore," Maggie warned. "This is about survival." But retreat was no longer possible. Too much truth had been revealed, and too many people were depending on justice finally being served. The community had split along lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and resolution would come through confrontation rather than compromise. The stage was set for a final accounting that would determine whether systematic corruption could be exposed and defeated through legal means, or whether it possessed enough power to eliminate threats through methods that courts would never investigate. The territorial courthouse buzzed with tension as residents from across the valley gathered for what everyone knew would be more than a simple property hearing. Word had spread through frontier networks that decades of corruption were about to be exposed in public testimony that powerful interests had tried desperately to prevent. Judge Harrison arrived from the territorial capital with a reputation for fairness that explained why Crawford had requested him specifically. His weathered face and direct manner suggested a man unimpressed by political connections or financial influence. Serafina entered the courthouse carrying herself with the dignity that had first caught Jeb's attention months earlier. The leather satchel containing copies of Ezekiel's evidence remained close at her side, protected by legal provisions that Cornelius's hired gunmen couldn't circumvent through intimidation. Crawford presented the inheritance claim with methodical precision, establishing Augustus Whitmore's military service, legal filing procedures, and documented property ownership. The basic facts proved uncontroversial because the evidence was overwhelming and meticulously preserved. Cornelius's attorney, a sharp-faced man from Denver with expensive clothes and calculating eyes, challenged procedural details without disputing fundamental truth. His strategy focused on technical objections designed to delay rather than defeat the claim. But Crawford had prepared for such tactics. When the defense questioned document authenticity, he produced Ezekiel's sworn testimony describing his personal knowledge of Augustus Whitmore's legitimate property acquisition and the subsequent conspiracy to steal it through bureaucratic manipulation. The courtroom fell silent as Ezekiel took the witness stand. His military bearing and decades of community respect gave weight to testimony that implicated multiple territorial officials in systematic corruption spanning 3 decades. "I watched them falsify survey records," Ezekiel stated with quiet conviction. "Saw them bribe land office clerks to lose proper filings. Witnessed them transfer stolen property to favored investors who knew exactly where their cheap land really came from." Cornelius's face grew increasingly pale as Ezekiel's testimony connected individual property thefts to a broader pattern of institutional corruption. The old soldier's first-hand accounts demolished any possibility that Augustus Whitmore's case represented isolated bureaucratic error. Crawford then presented financial records showing how the stolen properties had been systematically undervalued for tax purposes while being sold at market rates to connected buyers. The evidence revealed organized theft disguised as legitimate business transactions. Judge Harrison studied the documents with growing incredulity. "Are you telling this court that territorial officials conspired to steal property from deceased veterans and their families?" "I'm presenting evidence that speaks for itself, Your Honor," Crawford replied. The pattern suggests institutional corruption designed to transfer wealth from legitimate owners to politically connected interests. The defense attorney objected repeatedly, but his challenges crumbled against documentary evidence and eyewitness testimony that Crawford had organized into an unshakable case. Procedural delays couldn't overcome the fundamental truth of systematic theft spanning decades. When Cornelius finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealed the desperation of a man watching 30 years of careful construction collapse in real time. His explanations for the documented evidence grew increasingly implausible as Crawford methodically destroyed each attempted justification. "You inherited property your father acquired through fraudulent manipulation of territorial records," Crawford stated. "You've spent 30 years collecting illegal fees for water rights that legally belong to the Whitmore family." "I inherited legitimate business interests," Cornelius replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool courtroom air. Crawford produced survey maps showing how property boundaries had been altered to benefit the Blackwood family while excluding Augustus Whitmore's legitimate claim. The visual evidence made Cornelius's denials appear absurd rather than convincing. Judge Harrison's verdict came without extended deliberation. The evidence was too comprehensive and the pattern too clear for any reasonable doubt about systematic corruption. This court finds that Augustus Whitmore legally acquired the disputed property through proper military homestead procedures, Judge Harrison announced. The subsequent transfer to other parties resulted from fraudulent manipulation of territorial records and therefore lacks legal validity. He awarded Serafina full ownership of her grandfather's original claim, including water rights that formed the economic foundation of the entire valley. But more significantly, he ordered a territorial investigation into the broader corruption revealed through the evidence. These documents suggest criminal conspiracy involving multiple territorial officials, Judge Harrison continued. The evidence warrants investigation by federal authorities with jurisdiction over territorial administration. The verdict transformed more than property ownership. It validated Serafina's months of careful legal work and vindicated everyone who'd supported her claim against powerful opposition. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters celebrated not just Serafina's victory, but the exposure of corruption that had exploited their community for decades. Pete Garrison led cheers for the woman who'd saved his hand and his neighbor's property rights. Maggie embraced Serafina with genuine warmth that would have seemed impossible during their first hostile encounter. "You did something I never thought possible. You beat them at their own game using nothing but truth and stubbornness." Cornelius faced federal investigation, property seizure, and criminal charges that would likely end with imprisonment rather than mere financial penalty. His empire built on systematic theft crumbled as quickly as legal evidence had exposed its fraudulent foundation. 6 months later, Serafina stood before the schoolhouse she'd established using resources from her reclaimed inheritance. Children from across the valley attended classes where they learned reading, writing, and legal principles that would protect them from future exploitation. Jeb worked beside her as an equal partner in building institutions designed to prevent the corruption they'd defeated. Their relationship had grown from mutual respect through shared struggle into love, strengthened by common purpose. The valley prospered under fair water pricing and honest legal administration. Families who'd lost property to fraudulent manipulation began recovery processes that would restore their rightful inheritance. The systematic theft that had enriched connected insiders, while impoverishing legitimate owners, finally faced justice. Ezekiel found peace in knowing his 30-year guardianship had achieved its purpose. Augustus Whitmore's legacy lived on through his granddaughter's courage and the community transformation her victory had sparked. Serafina had arrived in Copper Ridge as a refugee seeking shelter from an unwanted marriage. She remained as the valley's most respected leader, proving that true power came from intelligence, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice regardless of personal cost.